Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a very special guest on, Michael Ciancio. Now, Michael, what makes you, I'm going to take a stab at kind of your background and let you expand on that a little bit. But you're a big SaaS guy, right? Been in SaaS marketing. You're a chief marketing officer. And in a SaaS company, and I'm a two-time SaaS founder, I mean, product marketing, the product can rule. We can have our perspectives that as soon as people understand what our product does, oh my goodness, the floodgates are going to open, right? And we know that it doesn't work that way, right? We know that there's a lot that we need to do in the marketplace to build trust, understand our customers, align internally, things that are very basic to the business that we don't always do. And we're going to shed a lot of light on that today. You've got a really unique perspective on that, but I would love for you just to maybe expand a little bit on your background before we get started here. And we found out that we both have kids that have a love of dance and gymnastics. And so we're deep into that world too.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, appreciate the introduction. I'll give you a little bit about myself, but sure, we've bonded a little bit unprofessionally, right? On a more personal level and different things that we have inside our family that are taking up a lot of our time. But more professionally, currently I'm the CMO at Expert Institute. It's a legal tech company that connects attorneys with expert witnesses and then powers that process through AI. But to your point, my background really is in B2B SaaS growth marketing, right? Across different types of industries, different types of categories, different types of technologies. And, two-time CMO, but the obsession has always kind of been the same. And that's, how do you build marketing that actually drives revenue and not just activity, right? And we talked about this a little bit last week during our prep call. So what I found over the last 15 or so years of doing this is that companies that struggle with marketing almost never have a creativity problem or a brand problem or a budget problem. They have a clarity problem, right? And that's foundational, right? They're unclear on who they serve. They're unclear on what makes them different. They're unclear on how marketing connects to the business. And I'd say that my job, regardless of the title and the role, has always been to bring that clarity and then build the engine around it, right? So the through line is clarity first and then execution second, but without the former, the latter is just really expensive noise, in my opinion. And we're all here for efficiency of spend. As at a personal level, as I said before, I'm married with two kids. My son, I spend most of my time coaching my son in varying different sports, but my daughter as well is a rising early star in varying aspects of dance and gymnastics and cheer. And when I'm not doing marketing, it does take a lot of our time. But as I said, I wouldn't trade the chaos for the world.
Well, we never would. And so I'm going to start with something there because I could interpret what you just said there is we're not good at the basics. We're not good at clarifying our competitive advantage in the marketplace. We're not clear at a clarity around who our customers are and how we serve them. These are basics in the industry. But let me tell you one thing. You and I, when we first met, and we talked about what do we want to talk about in this podcast, and I asked you a question. I said, "What do you think are the two biggest challenges to creating long-term sustainable growth?" Well, I've asked that question now of about 120 B2B C-suite executives, and by far the number one challenge to creating long-term sustainable growth is internal alignment on the very same things that you're talking about, right? Who is our ICP? How do we serve them, right? These are some of the most basic things in the marketplace that we learned about kind of, marketing 101. We took that in college.
Yep.
So I'd love to just ask you up front why you think it's that hard. Why is clarity and then alignment around that such a difficult thing?
Yeah, and I think growth. Let's simplify it. Like you said before, I think growth constraints are almost never what they appear to be on the surface, right? It looks like a pipeline problem. It might be a conversion problem. Like I said before, maybe a brand awareness problem. But when you trace it back through the organization, so let's talk internally, because I think that's the largest constraint. It's almost always a leadership alignment problem in varying different aspects, right? So what I mean by that specifically is that, you have a CEO, a CMO, a CRO, a CPO. I've missed 4 or 5 people in there, but that's a lot of people to keep aligned into the same goal line. But they don't share a simple agreed upon understanding of who the company serves and how it wins and what the priority is right now. And then every function underneath them is optimizing for a slightly different target. So we all have a North Star specifically that we're all kind of going for. But if you don't understand what the priorities are right now, so outside of just alignment, but also short, medium, long-term priorities to understand what that is, it's a slightly different target for each department, right? So you have, let's put it all together. You have marketing is generating leads that then sales doesn't value because they don't see the value in them. You got sales closing deals that customer success can't retain for very different aspects. You got product who's building features that maybe no one even asked for. We just think it's something that was cool that the customer might like, but we haven't done the research around it. And everyone's working extremely hard, but nothing reinforces anything else. So the challenge is that misalignment at the top is often very invisible. So you can sit in a leadership meeting, you can nod along to the same strategy presentations, you can walk out with 4 different interpretations of what it actually means. And that happens more often than not. And that the fix isn't, another strategy meeting. It's not another framework. It's just radical simplicity and a shared definition of the customer, the shared understanding of what that problem is. How do we win that? And then agreed upon explicitly, written down, and then communicated with context to every layer of the organization beneath it. And it sounds very, very simple, but most growth problems are just alignment problems in disguise. And that's something that you can't fix with a budget or anything else.
I love that. That's a takeaway one-liner. I interviewed a woman. She's former B2B CMO, partner at a consultancy that now does only go-to-market strategies with mid-market B2B companies. Mm-hmm. And she said, every single time we go in, we just learned we do an alignment, survey, because the problems in the company are always rooted in misalignment in the C-suite and then how it trickles down. Mm-hmm. Now, you in our conversation before talked about how that means that there's a lack of clarity, right? The lack of clarity doesn't hurt the company just internally, externally, and especially in this, ask engine optimization world and things like that. Could you explain a little bit more about kind of the impact of lack of clarity externally and what that means?
Yep. And I think I'll start a little bit from my chops, right? From a product marketing perspective. That's where my head always kind of goes, right? But the way that you want to speak to things needs to be effective for not just the buyers, right? It has to be for that perspective, because I'm going to apply it to an AI search perspective. But now it's kind of applying it to machines. And I'll go into a little bit further on that and what that looks like. So the job of product marketing historically has had 2 audiences. It's been buyers and sellers, right? You had different aspects, internal buyers and external buyers, and also internal sellers as well. You defined a category, you articulated the value prop, you enabled the sales team to go in, and that job still exists. That's a part of what marketing leadership and product marketing should do. But there's now a 3rd audience, I would say, that most teams aren't accounting for, and I'm just going to put them in a category called the machine. Okay? Yes. So what that means practically is that your content strategy has to account for how AI systems discover, ingest, and weight your information. And the content that performs best in that environment, right, isn't polished marketing copy. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be specific. And it's expert level language about real problems and real solutions. So let me give you a little bit more detail around that. One of the highest leveraging things that we're doing right now is actually interviewing subject matter experts and customers. We're transcribing those conversations using raw material to create content across multiple formats. So think articles, emails, social posts, you name it. And the reason that works is because you're capturing the exact language that real experts use to describe real problems. That's precisely what an LLM is scanning for when someone asks it a question in your category. It's not looking for your tagline. It's not looking for credible, substantive, like natural language conversations about the problem space. So instead of manufacturing that artificially, you should go directly to the source. So you talk to the people who live these problems every day. You capture it and you distribute it everywhere that you can. And that's product marketing for machines. And it has the added benefit of being genuinely useful content for human buyers too. So if you put something to it, I think a lot of people right now are writing for algorithms, right? And I think, how do I get my position? How do I get my brand? How do I get better visibility into AI search? Well, start capturing real expert voices and distributing them, and that's what both machines and buyers are actually going to trust in the long term.
So I have to stop, and I think we have to dig even deeper to what you're saying here. It's so important. Let me see if I've taken this away. In today's world, buyers are going to the LLMs more and more and more, doing their research, before they lock the day one shortlist. And in the world of what they get served up to them, what's returned to them when they ask their questions, the LLMs are looking for validation outside of our voice as the selling organization. They're looking for what the peer community is saying. They're looking for what the voice of the market is, the McKinsey's, the trusted voices in the industry.
Yep.
Right. And our voice isn't a trusted voice in the industry most often. And that's not me being hyperbolic about it. I mean, the recent Edelman Trust Barometer showed that 68% of respondents thought that business leaders like us were being intentionally misleading. Right? This is why the big part of why this whole trend is happening.
Yep.
So what my takeaway is, you're being very proactive. You're getting those trusted voices. You're getting insights, you're getting buyer truth, and you're embedding that into your content because that's what the LLMs reward. And by the way, it's how we think as humans. That's why the LLMs work that way, right? So it's optimizing for the machines, it's optimizing for the humans, but you're being proactive at it. And that's what I wanted to ask you about. You made a big point. You said, we're actually intentionally going out and doing interviews. Why is that important? Why can't you're having conversations with customers all the time in customer success. You're having conversations all the time with buyers in sales.
Yep.
Why did you proactively go out and do these interviews? What's different and what are you looking for in return?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it speaks to kind of the journey, right, of the buyer's journey of what it looks like now. Because to your point, there's a lack of trust incredulously, right? People already are saying without doing anything else, they don't trust brands more often than they actually trust brands, right? So the ability to take in your customer feedback, who to me is your best examples of exactly what you do, the things that you solve for, and that's all well and good, now needs to be synthesized into a different search, a different way of finding that information. And there was always that old adage of around 70% of people would do their research forever talking to a brand. That is not incorrect anymore. That is now quickened. And it's also being formed opinions from what the LLM is providing to that person inside of a lot of the things that they're searching for. So the buyer's journey is now being intermediated by AI before it ever reaches your website or your sales team. And that's a really hard position to be in, because before you could kind of control that narrative a little bit, but the LLM now is forming an opinion about your brand, your category, your competitors before any human does. And for the most part, and I was at a conference recently, we were discussing this, where like a lot of people are focused on the initial step of AI search, which is, share a voice and visibility in terms of the different types of AI platforms or Google AI overviews. But most marketing teams aren't building for that reality that I just spoke about, where people are leveraging this content, or LLMs are leveraging this content to give its opinion. So here's the frame that I use. Okay. So traditional SEO was about ranking on a page. That was always the thing. How do I get better rankings from SERPs, right? Inside of the SERPs. GEO is about being represented accurately and favorably inside an answer. So those are, to me, those are completely different problems. One's about clicks, and the other is about trust that you didn't earn in the room with a buyer that you never got to speak to, right? So what makes this particularly tricky is that AI systems don't just pull from your own content. And this gets into your point of like, why are we talking to the customer? Why are we leveraging those aspects? They pull from everything. Third-party coverage, analyst reports, review platforms, customer conversations, forum discussions. Those are just to name a few that LLMs are now synthesizing into a picture of who you are. And if that picture, going back to that consistency and message and who you're trying to serve, if that picture is fragmented or inconsistent, or even, I would say even a little thin, you're either going to get misrepresented or you get skipped over for a competitor who has done that work better than you have. And I think that's the next evolution for what marketing departments should be looking into, is because the brands that are going to win in AI search are the ones who have invested in consistent messaging, the credible third-party validation, and the systematic customer voice, not just as like a nice to have, but that's now like a core part of how you build market presence. And I would say that I push for everyone listening on the call, every marketing leader to ask themselves, if someone asked AI who the best solution is in your category, what would it say and why? And I would say that that's going to be a real conversation that you need to have with yourself in terms of now trying to control that narrative, but it needs to come from authentic categories, and that's where the customers come in.
So why can't you just rely on the sales conversations and the customer success conversations? And by the way, I had a 4-time B2B CRO on about 8 months ago, and he said, Steve, he says, you've got to have continual conversations, continual conversations with the customer, continual conversations with buyers. He said, but you've got to do it outside of the sales process. This was a 4-time B2B CRO. So you're intentionally creating conversations outside of the sales process to come to a different outcome. What is that? What is your thinking on that?
Yeah, and I think part of it has to do with, it's two things. One, it's the same adage that we just talked about in terms of people doing their research beforehand. I think the other aspect of really what it is a lot of companies have shifted away or drifted away from customer pain points, right? The best way to understand that is to get a better understanding directly from the customer. We're just having to leverage that now in more public forum to have those conversations. But more importantly, we need to have that understanding so that the sales team has better insight into what they're talking to on the sales side, because it starts with marketing before they even speak to anything from our perspective, but they're doing their research. So if you think about AI and what that involves from a customer pain point perspective, right? It's made it extraordinarily easy to produce like a high volume of content very quickly. Like AI is all about speed, and that's great. But I feel like what I see happening across like industries is that content is getting more polished, more consistent, and significantly less specific. It's technically correct, but I feel like it's an emotionally empty. And a lot of what you build is from that conversations you're having from those customers. So the problem with that, in my opinion, is fundamental to how B2B buying actually works today. It's very complex purchases. So to your point of your former colleague in CRL, they're very complex. It's the kind where like there's real risk attached to the decision, and it's not made on features, and they're made on recognition and trust. And the buyer wants to feel at a very visceral level that the vendor understands their world. It's not a categorical level. It's at a level where their specific situation is, they have pressures that they're under. They have, mistakes they've made before. There's a lot of emotion that comes into these decisions that marketing needs to understand and build this trust around. And getting to that level of specificity requires actual voice of the customer work. And you and I talked about this last week, and that's kind of what you do, right? Real interviews, surveys, real win-loss analysis. It's not conducted to pull a quote for a case study, even though that's very beneficial. But those days, have less and less value. It's conducted really to genuinely understand the language your buyer uses, so that when you learn that language and reflect it back inside of your marketing accurately, something very powerful happens. And I think from my experience, the buyer feels seen, right? And when the buyer has that, when they have that feeling of being seen, it's a foundation of trust. It's the holy grail of, it's the thing that makes someone think these people get it before they've ever spoken to a salesperson. And I think we have to, as marketing leaders, really build that trust beforehand, because our warm leads that we're sending over to sales, we're building that trust before a person ever gets on the phone. So most teams, because it's easy, they skip that work because it takes time and it's hard to attribute directly to pipeline and all the reasons why we know. But to me, that's a mistake. It's the highest leverage investment in the entire marketing function right now, that the teams that do real voice of customer work and build those specific messages will consistently outperform the ones that don't.
So I got to tell you, that was so articulate. And I want to ask you something about what you just said, because I had it put to me the other day this way.
Mm-hmm.
Sales conversations are happening farther and farther and deeper into the backside of the buyer's journey.
Mm-hmm.
Shortlists have already been determined before they want to talk to us. So decisions have been made. It's a lot of validation and confirmation conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Up front, to get onto the short list, is what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to build trust.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to be known as somebody who not only can I trust, but somebody that is knowledgeable, that understands me in the business more than a vendor. We can no longer afford to be vendors in the world today. We have to be perceived as, I even say, more than like a Gartner or Forrester trusted advisor, right? We have to be somebody that's seen in the middle of the conversation with the most important people that are in the industry. And that's why I love so much what you're doing. And you're being so proactive and getting out there and having those conversations. So I guess my question here is, then you pivoted directly to trust. Mm-hmm. And the trust battle, winning that trust battle, is harder than ever today. So we've talked a lot that I know is you're laying the foundation for building the trust, right? Mm-hmm. But if you could just lay out for us your trust building strategy, because this is where Forrester says we've got a demand gen strategy, right? We got brand strategy. We don't have trust strategy. Mm-hmm. And they recommend for CMOs, it's the number one thing that you should do, is you should have a plan, right? Mm-hmm. What's your trust plan?
Yep. And I'll make it very simple too, because I think, there's very different ways to do it inside of marketing, right? To build that trust. To me, it's more about a consistent brand foundation, because if you're talking about the entire journey, you should always start with the idea of what's the experience you want the customer to have, right? Obviously, you want to start with trust. You want them to feel comfortable. You want them to feel seen. You want them to then have a conversation with a salesperson once they're qualified to be like, yes, I understand. I trust this brand. So the person I'm talking to is now just building up that credibility. But I would say that message fragmentation, because if you think of the experience of what marketing's selling you on and kind of promoting into, to what the salesperson is saying, to what the delivery team and customer success is going to provide in the back end, and then what they're actually talking about post delivery in terms of like customer experience, the message fragmentation is one of the most underrated growth killers in marketing. And it's particularly insidious because it's very hard to diagnose. And let me give you an example. So like, when you're building up that trust, right, there's each individual piece of content looks fine on its own. Okay. When we're all building a lot of stuff, like we said, the homepage looks good. The emails look good. The sales decks look good. And we revise sales decks all the time. Right. But when you step back and you look at it all together, there are like 5 different versions of what the company does and who it does it for. And that foundational aspect of consistency is what the human reader does. They fill in those gaps. If you're not consistent in their message, they're going to say in that differentiation, a human reader can fill in those gaps. They bring context. They bring their own inferences. You're starting to deal with human emotion and psychology. They give you the benefit of the doubt in a lot of those ways and what that looks like. If you apply that to what the customer journey looks like now in terms of building trust, a lot of the ways that people are starting to build trust is through doing different types of research. That could be Google AI overviews, that could be inside of AI platforms. Those LLMs can't do that. They can't fill in the gaps for what that looks like.
Right.
So it synthesizes exactly what it finds. So if what it finds is inconsistent, if it builds an inconsistent picture of your brand, and that picture is what gets you served, to your next potential buyer, that's a really tough position to be in. So the discipline that I kind of push in every organization that I've worked with is lock the foundation before you do anything else. And like what you do, who you do it for, the value you deliver, and why you have that why you do it better than anybody else goes a really, really long way. And the core answer needs to be word for word consistent, whether it shows up in a paid ad, an email, a sales deck, a case study, and a media interview. Everything else, the tone, the format, the channel specific personalization, that's layered on top of that foundation. But if the foundation itself is inconsistent, every tactic you build underneath it is working against itself. And you're just spending money at that point to create confusion. So my strategy about how you build this trust is really like just lock the core message, and everything built on top of it gets more effective. It's a growth strategy. Consistency isn't really about creative constraint anymore. Just be consistent, because a lot of people that I've noticed, especially in the speed of innovation and the speed of business these days, is constantly changing their message. They're constantly trying to fine tune themselves to be different. You can optimize that, but be consistent in what that looks like. Give it time to grow, and that will build trust much longer term than anything you can create that's creative or buys their attention for kind of cheap clicks.
You put it in a way that a CFO, a CEO, a board member would understand. I can try to remember what you just said. You said, stop spending money to be inconsistent, right? Back to the internal alignment, that goes into then what messages are going out into the marketplace from sales, from marketing, what customer success is saying, the products that we're building, the literature that we're creating around it. A lack of internal alignment means we have a lack of consistency in message. If we have a lack of consistency in message, we're spending a lot of time and money doing exactly opposite of what you're saying, which is we need ultimate consistency. We need ultimate clarity. And we need to make sure that we're where we show up and where we're being seen by the LLMs, that they see and they recognize that clarity and consistency and what we're known for. And if we do that, the humans will too, right? And that's what ultimately builds trust in humans. That's what builds trust in the LLMs. So I guess, we've talked about so much, and I want to boil it down a little bit. If there was one thing that you wanted other C-suite executives that are going to be consuming this podcast to take away from our conversation today, what would that message be?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I always love these types of questions, because in the world of us always being busy, and we've probably all gotten pinged at the entire podcast here, and people are checking text messages. There's always something you want to foundationally give them, right? Of like, what is that key takeaway? And again, very simply put, but do the foundational work before you do anything else. Now, I know it's simple, but I watch marketing teams skip it constantly because it doesn't feel as productive as launching something new, right? When you have product market fit, here's what I mean by like foundational work. So you know exactly who you serve. It's not a demographic level, but at like a human level. Know their pain specifically enough that when they read your marketing, their reaction is, that's exactly my problem, right? Lock your core message so tightly that every single touch point, paid, organic, sales, CS, tells the exact same story. And make sure that your leadership team is genuinely aligned on all of it and not just nodding along in a meeting. Because once the foundation is in place, everything else gets dramatically more effective. So your paid media performs better because the message actually lands. Your content gets found because it's coherent and it's credible. Your sales team closes faster, right? Which is what our entire job here is, right? To get people to sign on to our products and services quicker, because The buyer already understands what you do and why it matters. And your customers advocate for you because the promise you made matched the reality that they experienced. So without that foundation, you're really just running a lot of tactics in parallel that don't reinforce each other and spending budget to create noise instead of a signal. And the teams that invest in getting this right before they scale are the ones that build something durable. And then tell me that's the work. That's the hard part because everything else follows from it. So before the campaigns, before the content, before they spend, the foundation you need to get right. And who you serve, what you solve, and why you, just lock that in, and everything else gets that much easier.
So I have to say something. I love every part of our conversation here. And I didn't even look at our discussion guide because it just kept flowing so well. And what you were saying, I had to ask more questions and more questions. There wasn't one thing that you said today that said, big part of what you need to do is an external challenge. Everything you talked about here was an internal challenge or opportunity, right? Call it what you want. But really everything that you just recommended here is you can look at it from two different ways. We have our own keys to the kingdom to grow. And it's ours. Nobody tells us how to grow. Nobody mandates that. I guess you could say the board does, right? But we as an overall company, right? Yep. We decide how we operate, how we align internally, how we message out to the marketplace. So one of my biggest takeaways from this is that we're actually our own biggest growth blockers. We need to recognize that. Right? And I know that's a very pessimistic way to look at it. So the optimistic way to look at that is we have our own ability to unlock opportunity and growth. And it's not dependent on anyone else.
Nope. And especially, like I said, when there's foundational work that's done, but even more so from a perspective of understanding that if you have product market fit, if you have the ability where there are certain things that you need to have to be a successful business. Do not get me wrong, right? That's why some are more successful than others, or some scale more than others. It's not just great marketing that goes around it. A lot of what I've seen is just internal transparency. And I mean radical transparency from the leadership level all the way down to any level inside of your organization, because a lot of people think transparency, right, how things grow is just sharing information. And I kind of push back on that framing, where sharing information is the easy part. What actually changes performance, both from a internal perspective and obviously from a growth perspective, is really sharing context. And I'll give you a quick example. Like, sharing information is telling your team, what happened last quarter. Sharing context is, telling them why it matters and how it connects to where the business is going and what it means for how they should be spending their time right now. The second thing is what actually changes behavior at the team level. And the other thing transparency does is it builds trust in both directions, right? A lot of what I think companies get in their own way is that when leaders are open about how the business is performing, but more importantly, where it's struggling and what the plan is to fix it, teams reciprocate with honesty about what's working and what isn't. And I feel like a lot of people's lack of growth come from the internal politics of just trying to parade the positive numbers and all the great things that we're doing, but no one wants to have the honest conversations that need to be happening at a leadership level and even at, the manager level, because that feedback loop is genuinely one of the most valuable things a leadership team can create. And most companies never build it because it requires real vulnerability from the top, that when you're open with each other and you're honest with each other, and no one ever is 100% accurate in everything that they do, but you should be able to have those vulnerable conversations on what are the issues more often than what is successful. Because if you fix your vulnerabilities, your scalability is not a problem anymore. So internally, it's a lot about building that trust, but it's also about being very vulnerable.
I love it. I wish we had another couple hours because this is incredible. And, the whole mission of this podcast is to bring different C-suite leaders together from all over the world, share our experiences, share what we've tried, share our
Mm.
failures, share our vulnerabilities, share what's going right. And if we do that, I call it the rising tide that lifts all boats. And you
Mhm.
were definitely an amazing part of that rising tide today. So, Michael, I just want to say thank you for coming on.
Appreciate you having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I always love having these types of conversation even outside of podcasts, right? We only learn from each other, and this is the great venue of podcasts now that allow us to just learn from other leaders. And we don't have all the answers, but if we put our heads together, we can pretty much solve for anything.